From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Have you ever tried a jury trial?
I have not.
Civil?
No.
Criminal?
No.
Bench?
No.
State or federal court?
I have not.
President Trump's nominee to a lifetime appointment on the U.S. District Court in Washington withdrew from consideration after he was unable to answer basic questions about the law. President Trump is setting a record for the most appellate judges confirmed in a president's first year in office.
He has already appointed more people in less time than any other president. And the people he's appointed are very conservative. And it will change the courts for decades to come, longer than we'll remember him as president.
We'll speak with retired Judge Shira Shenlin about how Trump's new team of judges will radically change American society. Then we look at what some have called the most progressive city council in New York City history and the woman who helped lead the agenda, Speaker Melissa Mark Viverito, who holds the second most powerful post in New York City.
12 years ago, when I was first sworn in as the first Latina, the first Puerto Riqueña to represent my district of El Barrio, East Harlem, and the Bronx, I tried to process what that all meant. I was a labor organizer, a community activist of Mujer del Barrio, not a politician.
Her term winds down at the end of this year due to term limits. We'll look at how, under Melissa Mark Viverito's tenure, this New York City Council expanded paid sick leave, a municipal identification card for undocumented immigrants, and got Mayor Bill de Blasio to agree to close the city's notorious Rikers Island jail. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. A New York Times investigation has revealed how the Department of Homeland Security is increasingly going global, with thousands of ICE agents and TSA officials deployed in more than 70 countries around the world. The New York Times reports hundreds more DHS workers are deployed at sea, on Coast Guard ships, or in the skies on surveillance planes. Some countries have accused DHS of attempting to export the United States' restrictive immigration laws, with one German politician saying DHS's interrogations and detentions at foreign airports constitute an extrajudicial travel ban. The United States has imposed new sanctions on 2 North Korean officials only days after the UN Security Council imposed another round of sanctions against North Korea in response to its recent ballistic missile tests. North Korea called the most recent UN Security Council sanctions an act of war. The new U.S. Treasury sanctions freeze all U.S. assets of 2 North Korean officials accused of being behind the missile program. Russia has offered to act as mediator between North Korea and the United States amidst the escalating conflict between the two countries. North Korea has repeatedly tested intercontinental ballistic missiles over the last year, while President Trump has repeatedly threatened to use nuclear weapons against North Korea, saying he would totally destroy the nation of 25 million people. President Obama gave a rare radio interview conducted by Prince Harry for the BBC. While President Obama did not mention President Trump by name, Obama spoke forcefully about the importance of free speech and the dangers posed by increasing polarization of news and discourse, particularly online.
As a former constitutional lawyer, pretty firm about the merits of free speech, and the question, I think, really has to do with how do we harness this technology in a way that allows a multiplicity of voices, allows a diversity of views, but doesn't lead to a balkanization of our society, but rather continues to promote ways of finding common ground. One of the dangers of the internet is that people can have entirely different realities. They can be just cocooned in information that reinforces their current biases. One of the things that I think I discovered even back in 2007, 2008, is a good way of fighting against that is making sure that online communities don't just stay online.
In In the radio interview, which was taped earlier this year but just released, former President Barack Obama also praised youth across the world.
The generation coming up is the most sophisticated, the most tolerant in many ways, most embracing of diversity, the most tech-savvy, the most entrepreneurial, but they don't have much faith in existing institutions.
That's President Obama speaking in a rare radio interview conducted by Prince Harry for the BBC. Environmentalists are warning fossil fuel companies are investing a staggering $180 billion in the global plastics industry, threatening to propel a 40% rise in the production of plastics over the next 10 years. The Guardian reports the fossil fuel companies plunging money into plastics include ExxonMobil and Shell. Experts warn plastic production is already disastrously polluting oceans, causing what some environmentalists call an ocean Armageddon. Egypt has executed 15 people convicted of carrying out attacks on the Egyptian military in the Sinai Peninsula in 2013. The hangings carried out on Tuesday were the first mass execution in Egypt in 2 years. Meanwhile, in more news from Egypt, labor lawyer Khalid Ali has announced his intention to run for president, pitting the left activists against authoritarian Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. Khalid Ali was among the labor leaders who helped support nationwide strikes in Egypt in 2011 amidst the uprising that toppled former military dictator Hosni Mubarak. This is Ali speaking in Democracy Now! Interview in 2011.
The workers have successfully launched and sustained the largest wave of labor mobilizations this country has seen from 2004 until 2011. The workers are the ones who brought down the structures of this regime in the past years. Workers laid the ground for the emergence of this revolution. And I believe that any analysis which says otherwise is superficial.
That was labor lawyer and now Egyptian presidential candidate Khalid Ali speaking in a Democracy Now! Interview in 2011. Egypt's presidential election is slated to take place this coming spring. In Chile, a court has sentenced 4 retired military officials to prison in connection with the kidnapping of activist and university student Maria Angelica Andrade Bravo in 1974 under Pinochet's dictatorship. After being kidnapped, the student was transferred to multiple secret prison sites, tortured, and then forcibly disappeared. The 4 retired military members were sentenced to between 10 and 13 years in prison. Back in the United States, officials in Erie, Pennsylvania, have declared a state of emergency after a staggering 63 inches of snow. That's more than 5 feet. Fell on Erie over the last 4 days. Even more snow is expected today. Pennsylvania is deploying National Guard with Humvee ambulances because the snow is so high, regular ambulances and other emergency vehicles can't traverse some streets. The massive snowfall has shattered multiple previous records. So far, Erie has received 97 inches of snow this month, nearly the amount of snow the city receives on average during an entire winter. Scientists have linked extreme precipitation, including snowfall, to climate change. Meanwhile, parts of the Northeast and Midwest are experiencing a bitter cold spell, with the temperatures on Christmas hitting record lows in Minnesota, and meteorologists predicting more record-shattering cold in the days to come. In Washington, D.C., whistleblower groups have expressed concern after the man charged with handling whistleblower complaints at U.S. spy agencies was put on leave and marched out of his office earlier this fall. Dan Meyer was the director of the Intelligence Community Whistleblowing and Source Protection Program before he was put on leave in late November. The Project on Government Oversight said, quote, "This looks like a blatant attempt to get rid of him simply because he's doing his job," unquote. And in Washington, D.C., author activist and policy advocate Marcus Raskin has died at the age of 83. Raskin was the co-founder of the Institute for Policy Studies, one of Washington's most influential liberal think tanks. He's the author or co-author of more than 20 books on civil rights, the national security, state, and foreign policy, including his 1965 book, The Vietnam Reader, which helped spark a wave of teach-ins at college campuses nationwide. He was also a member of the Boston Five, a group tried in 1968 for conspiracy to help people avoid the draft. In the early 1970s, he was placed on President Richard Nixon's enemies list, and in 1971, he reportedly helped connect Pentagon Papers whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg with the New York Times. He's survived by his wife and 4 children, including Maryland Democratic Congress member Jamie Raskin. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our viewers and listeners around the country and around the world. We begin today's show looking at how President Trump is shaping the federal judiciary with the confirmation of a 12th Circuit Court judge earlier this month. Trump set a record for the most appellate judges confirmed in a president's first year in office. President Trump began his term having to fill 150 vacancies in the federal courts, or about 10% of the federal judiciary, largely due to a backlog caused by Republican obstruction of confirmations during the Obama administration. Early in his first year in office, Trump appointed conservative Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch. But legal experts say Trump's appointments to the lower courts will have the most impact on American life because those courts decide nearly all cases, ranging from voting rights and contraception to gay rights and immigration. Many of Trump's appointees have drawn scrutiny, including Leonard Grass, who the Senate confirmed earlier this month to the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals, despite a not qualified rating from the American Bar Association. Gratz is one of the at least 4 Trump nominees the ABA deemed not qualified. Meanwhile, Trump's nominee to a lifetime appointment on the U.S. District Court in Washington withdrew from consideration after widely circulated video showed he was unable to answer basic questions about the law and had never tried a case in court. This is Louisiana Republican John Kennedy questioning Matthew Peterson at a Senate Judiciary Committee confirmation hearing earlier this month.
Have you ever tried a jury trial?
I have not.
Civil?
No.
Criminal?
No.
Bench?
No.
State or federal court?
I have not.
Okay. Have you ever taken a deposition?
I was involved in taking depositions.
Matthew Peterson's withdrawal came after the Judiciary Committee rejected 2 of President Trump's other nominees this month. Texas lawyer Jeff Mateer, who has called transgender children evidence of Satan's plan, and blogger Brett Talley, who has rated unanimously unqualified for a judicial post by the American Bar Association. Well, for more, we're joined by Judge Shira Shenlin. She served 22 years as United States District Judge for the Southern District of New York. She was appointed by Bill Clinton and left the bench in April of last year. She's a member of the Executive Committee of the Board of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. Her recent piece published in The Guardian is headlined, "Trump's New Team of Judges Will Radically Change American Society," and also has a recent op-ed piece in the New York Times. Judge Shenlin, it's a pleasure to have you here. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Talk about what is happening now with the federal judiciary.
A lot is happening right now, and as you already said, at record speed. You mentioned that 12 circuit judges have been confirmed. The previous high was 3, and that was President Obama got 3 circuit judges confirmed in his first year. So we are seeing a rapid effort to pack the courts with what can only be termed very conservative judges and justices. We have 1 Supreme Court justice, and everybody pays a lot of attention to that. But the reality is that the lower courts is where the action is. So on the 13 circuit courts, they write 60,000 opinions. The Supreme Court writes 62. So you can see that the final word in most cases is at the appellate level. The trial courts write several 100,000 opinions per year. There are a total of about 179 circuit judges throughout the country, 677 district court judges. And as you know, a Supreme Court vacancy is a very rare event. So if those lower courts become filled with very conservative judges, all of whom who have life tenure, all of whom will serve 30 to 40 years, then the impact of these appointments will last for decades. And the judges he's picked are not going to be friendly to abortion rights, gay rights, affirmative action, voting rights, so many issues that affect so many people on a daily basis. They're anti-regulation. There's just so many subject matters that will change when these folks become the majority on the various appellate and district courts.
Well, you've written that Trump has not only rushed all these appointments, but he's also ceded the selection of the judges to the Federalist Society and the Heritage Foundation.
That seems true. Those are the go-to sources that he uses to find qualified, in his view, qualified candidates for the federal courts. So when he wants to find people who think as he thinks, or who will become judges in the mold that he would like to see, he goes to those sources to find the candidates. And obviously doesn't vet them too well. As you already pointed out, a couple of them have no business on any trial court or any appellate court because they have no judicial experience whatsoever, no courtroom experience.
In today's New York Times, Reverend Bishop William Barber, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, wrote about Trump's nomination of Thomas Alvin Farr, a protege of Senator Jesse Helms, to serve on the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of North Carolina. Barber writes about Farr's connections to white supremacist causes and writes, quote, Mr. Farr's former law partner, Thomas Ellis, was Mr. Helms' top deputy for decades. He also served as a director of the Nazi-inspired pro-eugenics Pioneer Fund and used funding from that organization to create and bankroll a network of interlocking organizations to support Mr. Helms and other political candidates who espoused the notion of a superior white race and opposed civil rights. Barber went on to write, quote, African Americans seeking to have their rights protected under federal law have much to fear if Mr. Farr takes the bench. This is particularly the case in the Eastern District of North Carolina, which covers an area where about half the state's African American residents live and is often referred to as its Black Belt. Now, those are the words of William Barber, the well-known civil rights activist. Judge Shenlin, can you talk about Mr. Farr and the significance of Trump's choice?
Well, I can a little bit. I wrote about Mr. Farr also in my New York Times op-ed, but in a much reduced fashion because I wrote about 4 nominees rather than 1. And I pointed out many of the same things. But one fact that I also pointed out is that President Bush had nominated Mr. Farr in 2006, but he didn't go through. I mean, even then, that Congress said, no way, this person should not be on the federal bench. Now he comes back, redux, 12 years later, and suddenly he's going to be acceptable. Now, what has changed? What has changed? We don't have the filibuster rule. This is very important to explain. It used to take 60 votes, but now it takes only a bare majority. Now, that changed under the Democrats in 2013, but they had to do it. They had to use that nuclear option because their picks were being blocked in the Senate. And while they knew they did that at their own peril, that it would come back to haunt them, there are many who believe, even if they hadn't done it, it would be done now. The Republicans would do the same thing. So 6 of the Trump judges have already been confirmed with far less than 60 votes. They would never have been confirmed before. And that's going to happen with Farr if he's confirmed. Now, the other thing I would say about Farr is that it's a district court nominee. That's the lowest court. That's the trial court. Thankfully, right now, he's not being nominated for an appellate court. But it wouldn't surprise me if he is confirmed. In the next 2-3 years, they'll put him up for the circuit court. I have no doubt about that. This is a person who does not belong on the federal bench. His views are unacceptable to the vast majority of Americans. That's the problem with the Trump picks. They're simply not mainstream people. They are extremists. And this man is an extremist who doesn't belong on the federal bench, does not understand fairness and justice, and he'll turn the clock back. He was a great supporter of North Carolina's voter suppression law, which the circuit reversed and said it targeted with almost surgical precision against black voters. So this is a dangerous person to put on the bench.
Well, one of the things that you've raised is that in the past, even though there's always been partisan voting in the Senate on these judges, there was always a basic understanding that a person had to be qualified. And now we're seeing a record number of people who are deemed unqualified by the American Bar Association. Your sense of that?
Well, there are two things to say. While presidents always picked people who would reflect their own values, there was a lot of consensus. There was a lot of bipartisan support. Most district court nominees were approved in the 90s. That is 90 votes, 95, 93, 90-something. The vast majority were approved bipartisan for the district courts in particular. I'm sure my own vote was in the 90s when I was approved by Congress. So we didn't see votes of 51. We didn't even see votes of 60. People were approved because there was consensus, and the home state senators had a role, and they're trying to undo that. So things have changed remarkably now. There's no bipartisanship. It's strictly partisan line voting on a number of these people.
Now, for people who are not judges or lawyers, can you explain the difference between the district court, the appeals court, what it means to be a federal judge like yourself, a state judge, and what are the cases each one hears?
That's a lot of questions at once, and I'll try to straighten that out. So the federal courts hear both civil and criminal cases, but that involve federal laws or the Constitution. The state courts do local things like local crime, domestic relationships, wills, real estate, housing, landlord-tenant court, very different kinds of issues. So let's turn back to the federal courts. First of all, the federal courts are lifetime appointments. They're not elected. They're appointed by each president. And people do tend to stay 30 years on average. They hear terrorism cases on the criminal side. They hear political corruption cases. They hear narcotics cases, drug cases, but so do the state courts, so that can be a little bit of both. But they have a broader focus on the criminal side. On the civil side, of course, they hear civil rights cases that arise under the Constitution, and as you know, I've handled some of those myself over the years. So it's a very different court. Now, you also asked me to explain the trial courts and the appellate courts. So the trial courts, which is what we call the lowest court, the district court, it doesn't mean we're lowly, it just means we're first. So the district courts try the cases. The case is filed there, the case is tried there, and the district court really sets the stage. I think it's the best job of all because—
And that's where you served.
That's where I served for 22 years, and you get to write the first opinion. You really shape the case. Then the circuit court reviews what you did, but they can only deal with the record you created. So they sit on top of you, and they review what you do. And as I said before, they write maybe 60,000 decisions, and the lower courts write maybe 355,000. Okay, then from there you get to the Supreme Court, but only extremely rarely, since they average between 65 and 80 cases a year now. Imagine the odds of ever being heard in the Supreme Court. So really the courts of appeals are the last stop. Now there are 13 of them, and when President Obama took office, 10 of those 13 had a majority of Republican-appointed judges. But when he left, only 4 were majority Republican-appointed. In other words, he shifted the balance of the circuit courts. What we're going to see now is a shift back. So this rapid effort to get circuit judges confirmed, that's what President Trump has done more than any. 12 have been confirmed for the circuit courts, is to shift that balance as fast as possible.
We're going to break. When we come back, we're going to also ask about some of your cases, like the very well-known stop and frisk case in New York, and also the other judges that you are, or the nominees that you are concerned about. Judge Shira Shenlin is former U.S. District Judge for the Southern District of New York, where she served 22 years. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back with her. Then we'll be speaking with the first Latino City Council Speaker of New York City, who's ending her term. We'll try to also find out where she's headed. Melissa Mark Viverito. Stay with us.
and make it right. I'm caught up in your flaws tonight, so you can transform my world. Man, the fortress, you're so tight. Just scratch me up and make it right. I'm caught up in your flaws tonight, so you can transform my world. Man, the fortress, you're so tight. Just scratch me up and make it right. I'm caught up in your flaws tonight, so you can transform my world.
That's Tight by the Coup. The group's longtime DJ, hip-hop pioneer Pam the Funkstress died last Friday at the age of 51. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Our guest is the former district judge, Shira Shandlin, who's written both pieces in the New York Times and in The Guardian about her concern about Trump's nominees and shaping of the federal court in just his first year in office. Juan?
Well, I wanted to ask you about something else. In January of 2014, New York City's newly elected mayor, Bill de Blasio, announced the city would drop its appeal of a ruling by a U.S. district court that found the controversial policy of stop and frisk unconstitutional, and he would settle an ongoing lawsuit. Mayor de Blasio delivered the news at a community center in Brownsville, Brooklyn, a predominantly African-American neighborhood that's had more stop and frisk than any other part of the city.
We believe in ending the overuse of stop and frisk that has unfairly targeted young African American and Latino men. We believe in our obligation, the most fundamental one that there is in government, to keep people safe. And the values and strategies that keep people safe and that really give us lasting safety, those values are not compatible with a broken and misused stop and frisk policy.
That's Mayor Bill de Blasio talking about a case overseen by our guest, federal judge Shira Shandlin, former U.S. district judge for the Southern District of New York, where she served for 22 years, was appointed by President Bill Clinton, member of the executive committee of the board of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. This was a huge decision. I mean, the number of young black and brown, usually men, we were talking about, what, 700,000 or more a year, a kind of initiation as they became 10, 11, 12, 13 years old. Talk about your decision.
First of all, it was the most important decision I wrote in all those years. It was a very, very major case because it affected the lives of so many hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers. And I put many years into that case and studied the problem deeply. And what was very satisfying about that case is that I found the stop and frisk effort as practiced was unconstitutional. In other words, you can make stops and frisks, but only if you do it in accordance with the Constitution. A lot of people misunderstood the ruling. I didn't say you can't do it, but you have to do it constitutionally. And it was not being done constitutionally, in my view. It was done with racial profiling. So hundreds of thousands of young black men, as you said, were stopped, and it's a big thing to be stopped and frisked. We don't realize it because we're not likely. I'm not likely, and probably neither of you are likely to be stopped or frisked. But it's a real intrusion, and it often goes bad. When you think of the young black men who've been shot, it's because a stop went bad. So it's a dangerous thing to be stopped, and you can often end up with an arrest. Anyway, the good news was the stops dropped by 97% as a result of my ruling. So it went down from 700,000 to less than 50,000 with no rise in crime. And that was satisfying because had crime gone shooting up, as the then mayor and then police commissioner predicted, people would have said, it's your fault. This city has burnt up and it's your fault. But it didn't happen that way.
One of the amazing things, I remember I was still working as a columnist at the Daily News then. I was surprised by the efforts of the Mayor Bloomberg's administration and Commissioner Ray Kelly at the time to attempt to discredit you, the judge. They actually tried to get stories planted in the local press attacking you.
Absolutely, and I saw that coming when the plaintiff's lawyer said, we no longer want to have a jury. We want to have a non-jury trial, so we're dropping our claims for damages. I said, oh, no, they're going to attack the judge, whatever the judge rules. You're better off with the jury because that's the voice of the people. They said, no, we've made a decision. We don't want damages. We just want what's called equitable relief. We want you to try the case. So I knew that I was going to be in the crosshairs of the mayor and the police commissioner, and I was. There were stories that were planted that were basically untrue in the sense that they were so slanted, so unrealistic. You can jigger any statistics, and they did. And so they went after me before the decision, and during the trial, and after the decision, and it was not a pleasant experience.
So I wanted to go to what candidate Donald Trump said when he was running, calling for a nationwide stop-and-frisk program at a town hall meeting hosted by Fox News. This is town hall participant Ricardo Sims questioning Trump.
There's been a lot of violence in the black community. I want to know, what would you do to help stop that violence, you know, black on black crime?
Right. Well, one of the things I'd do, Ricardo, is I would do stop and frisk. I think you have to. We did it in New York. It worked incredibly well. And you have to be proactive. And, you know, you really help people sort of change their mind automatically. You understand. You have to have, in my opinion, I see what's going on here. I see what's going on in Chicago. I think stop and frisk. In New York City, it was so incredible the way it worked. Now, we had a very good mayor, but New York City was incredible the way that worked. So I think that would be one step you could do.
It was so incredible how it worked in New York City, candidate Trump said, who has now become president. Now, this was after your ruling. Also, just, you know, the news today is that the murder rate in New York is the lowest it's ever been since record-keeping began. But, Judge Sheindlin, what this means, and are you seeing what President Trump is attempting to do?
Am I seeing what he's attempting? I mean,
have you seen him trying to well, what he talks about is a federal stop-and-frisk program.
There's no such thing. It really showed, sorry to say, his ignorance. He raised this also in the presidential debate, the first debate. He again attacked me personally. He said, oh, that judge, she was a terrible judge. She ended this wonderful policy. So he did that nationally in a presidential debate. But he showed his ignorance because he has no control over local police policies. Federal law or federal authorities don't control local police. So he can't institute excuse me, a national stop-and-frisk policy, and he didn't know that. I thought in that first debate he was frankly being coached by Rudy Giuliani, the former mayor. He was repeating lines that Giuliani had fed him. Former Mayor Giuliani came into that appeal along with former Attorney General Michael Mukasey, and it was the power of Giuliani and Mukasey that really caused the stay to be granted and all that followed that. But the bottom line is that it was a bad policy. It was not effective law enforcement, as we now know, because with a drop of 97% and no rise in crime and the lowest murder rate, it obviously wasn't deterring crime. All it was doing was alienating the community from the police. And that's the last thing you want. The community said at that time, I wouldn't talk to the police if I saw a crime in progress. I wouldn't help them. I wouldn't talk to them. Now we're trying to work together, the police and the community. And that's effective law enforcement. So it was ineffective. He's just wrong.
And Judge, I wanted to ask you, you left the bench. As you mentioned, it's a lifetime appointment.
Right.
And, but you left the bench at a relatively early age for a judge.
Right.
Could you talk about what you're doing now?
Oh, well, that's a pleasure. Thank you for that question. I left because I had done it for a long time, and I felt I'd made an impact in many areas of the law, and it was time to have a different life. One thing I wanted was to be able to speak out. I wanted to write and to speak, and this is the kind of opportunity that I now have. As you pointed out, a couple of the op-eds, I think I've had 6 op-eds in the first 18 months. I've also had the pleasure of speaking on programs like this, which is important because you reach hundreds of thousands of viewers, and I want them to hear what I have to say. I want them to understand the federal courts. I want them to understand the effect of this president's appointments. Now, if the majority changes in the Senate, we may not see rote confirmations in the second 2 years of the first term.
So let's go back to some of the judges that you are concerned about, that you've written about. For example, Damian Schiff, the lawyer for the Libertarian Pacific Legal Foundation, nominated to the Court of Federal Claims, which primarily hears suits seeking damages from the government. He has called, you write, the Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy a judicial prostitute.
Right, he has. And this is not the kind of person that one would want to give life tenure to on a federal bench. He also said that the court's ruling on affirmative action, which only permitted race to be a consideration in college admissions, just one consideration, was as bad as the decision in Dred Scott, which upheld fugitive slave laws, or Plessy versus Ferguson, which upheld states' rights to require racially segregated public accommodations, or Korematsu versus United States, which approved the internment of Japanese Americans. He equated Grutter versus Bollinger, which merely said a college can consider race with these terrible decisions. So this man doesn't sound to me to be someone who is qualified to or has the right temperament to be on the federal bench.
Another district court nominee, Mark Norris, suggesting that being Muslim is synonymous with being a terrorist.
Well, I can only turn back to you and say, can you imagine to take a whole group of people, a nationality, and accuse all of them in one sentence of being terrorists? That's what he's saying. That if you're Muslim, which is a religion which affects millions, maybe billions of people around the world, they can't all be terrorists. They're good and decent people, but he equates them. Again, is that the kind of person we want to make the fine distinctions and decisions that a judge has to make? Doesn't sound that way to me.
I wanted to ask you about John Bush. John Bush, overwhelmingly confirmed on party lines. While blogging under a pseudonym in 2008, you wrote, he compared the Dred Scott decision to Roe v. Wade, saying both relied on similar reasoning and activist justices, and that slavery and abortion are the two greatest tragedies in our country.
Well, I first point out his confirmation was 51 to 47. You've seen that split before. You saw it a week ago on the tax bill. So what we're seeing there is straight party line voting. Again, the person who would equate abortion and slavery is simply mixed up and not qualified. I don't know how else to phrase it. I find it personally offensive that someone of that view would sit on a United States Court of Appeals probably for the next 20 or 30 years.
And finally, so-called judges. President Judge referring to the President Trump referring to the so-called judges.
You know, I've never been speechless, and it almost leaves me speechless to think that a president of the United States would treat a coordinate branch of government in that way and call federal judges who work so hard and are, by and large, so decent and so committed to their work, so-called, when obviously these are fine people who take their job seriously. And I think the vast majority really want to do justice and do in a very fair and equal manner. So that was an outrageous comment.
Well, Judge Shira Shenlin, we thank you so much for being with us, former United States District Judge for the Southern District of New York, where she served for 22 years. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, the first Latina City Council Speaker of New York City. We will be joined by Melissa Mark Viverito. Stay with us.
New York, you're safer, and you're wasting my time. Our records all show you were filthy but fine. But they shuttered your stores when you opened the doors to the cops who were bored once they'd run out of crime. New York, you're perfect, oh please don't change a thing. Your mild billionaire mayor's now convinced he's a king. And so the boring collect, I mean all disrespect. In the neighborhood bars I'd once dreamt I would drink. New York, I love you, but you're freaking me out.
New York, I love you, but you're bringing me down by LCD Sound System. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We turn now to what some have called one of the most progressive city councils in New York City's history, and the woman who helped lead the agenda, Speaker Melissa Mark Viverito, the second most powerful post in city government. Her term winds down at the end of this year due to term limits. She gave her farewell address last week.
12 years ago, when I was first sworn in as the first Latina, the first Puerto Riqueña to represent my district of El Barrio, East Harlem, and the Bronx, I tried to process what that all meant. I was a labor organizer, a community activist of Mujer del Barrio, not a politician. But I knew as a council member I had a real chance to be a voice for all those in our city who for too long have been cast aside and silenced. The poor, the undocumented, nuestros viejitos, and every single New Yorker who felt that there was more to be done to make our great city more responsive, fair, and just for our people.
Melissa Mark Viverito was first elected to the New York City Council in 2005, was named Speaker 2014. During her time as City Council Speaker, the council expanded living wage requirements, expanded paid sick leave, established a city bail fund and a municipal identification card for undocumented immigrants, limited cooperation between immigration authorities and the city's police and jails, also funded free legal advice for immigrants in detention who face deportation. During her tenure, she also got Mayor Bill de Blasio to agree to close New York's notorious Rikers Island jail. To talk more about this and where she plans to go next, we're joined here in studio by New York City Council Speaker Melissa Mark Viverito, whose term ends at the end of the year. Welcome back to Democracy Now!
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
What are you most proud of right now in this last slew of bills? Was this the largest number of laws that have been passed in any city council in the country in one fell swoop?
Well, in the 4 years that I served as Speaker, we passed about 700 pieces of legislation. And I think that, you know, some people have been critical of that number, but I think what it demonstrates is the kind of leadership style that I have, right? I always said when I came into the council that I wanted to be a member-focused body, that before had been very speaker-driven, very speaker-focused, that my interest was to be more collaborative with my colleagues and let them define what their priorities were and work with them to facilitate that. So I'm very proud. In terms of the scope of work, I mean, we've done so much, and obviously it's been incredibly humbling to lead this body and be in this position, but the work that I've done on immigration and the work that I've done with regards to criminal justice reform would be the two areas that I would say I'm most proud in terms of the legacy and the amount of work that we've done in each of those areas.
Well, I wanted to ask you specifically about criminal justice reform, because clearly there were a slew of different bills that were passed during your time as Speaker, but yes. I would think that the most important was the commission that you established to review the situation with Rikers Island and its stunning report. And I've always said to people, read the actual Lippman Commission report, which is really an analysis of the mass incarceration system in this country, but specifically in terms of New York City. And I was stunned by the power of the report, and then that you were able to get the mayor, who was not willing at first to go along with this, to move. So if you could talk about that.
Sure. I mean, you know, we cannot govern in a vacuum. The way that, again, part of my leadership style is that we got to really have voices, diverse voices at the table on any given issue and really figure out what is the best path. So the Independent Commission was led by Judge Lippman, but it had and convened a wide range of voices on the issue of incarceration and the issue of reforming our jail system or reforming our criminal justice system. And that commission worked for about a year and really deliberated on if there was a way to get to a point where we could close Rikers Island down and do a more community-based approach of a jail system. And that is what basically the commission said. The commission said that there is a path and there is a way to close Rikers Island down, and therefore I supported that, right? I've convened the commission and supported that, and actually was able to then facilitate a point where everybody basically is around that position. And I want to thank the advocates. The advocates really are ones that raised their voice about this. But we have a path, and that commission really does lay out the path of how we can arrive at that point.
Could you share with us some of the conversations you had with the mayor to get him to go along with this?
I mean, I think it's hard when you have people with such experience and understanding of this issue that there is a way to do it. Now, the issue is the timeline. How quickly can we get it shut down? 10 years, there's a way of possibly maybe shortening that timeline. But definitely it was...
And explain what Rikers is for people who don't understand. What is this island, and what is this It's not one jail.
No, it's about 9 jails. It's our jail system. And the vast majority who are there are people who are awaiting their trial dates. There are the vast majority, about 80 to 85% of the people in Rikers. There are people who cannot pay bail because they're too poor to pay bail, and therefore they stay in Rikers longer than they need to. I think the example that we unfortunately use as what's wrong with the system is Kalief Browder, who was a young man accused of having stolen a backpack, and for not being able to pay bail, was in Rikers for 3 years. And the horror of living that. It's a violent place. It's an inhumane place. It's very removed and isolated from your family and your networks. That young man, once he left Rikers Island, because of that experience, it broke him down, and he committed suicide.
I mean, he was beaten by guards. He was beaten by other prisoners.
Right.
And he just kept saying, I can't say that I stole this backpack in a plea agreement because I didn't.
Exactly. So that's the example of what's wrong with this system, which again is made up of multiple jails. So the approach of the Independent Commission is that first we have to reform laws, we have to change laws, we have to change our approach to policing and incarceration in general, but we can get the population to a point where we can then go to the community-based facility models, where people should be able to await their trial dates, or if you're in jail for a year or less, if you have some sort of time that you have to spend in jail, that you can do it closer to your networks. Your family can visit you. You can talk about other ways of having people complete their time. We have to really look and re-envision the way that we do incarceration in this city and how we approach criminal justice in general. And so the commission is something that I'm very proud of.
So how did you get Bill de Blasio to do it?
Listen, my style is just, engage in conversation. Judge Lippman and I had multiple conversations with the mayor, and we arrived at a point, where I was happy that he's also, come on board, and so has the governor and everybody else. And we can now really focus on making sure that we implement whatever policies we have to make sure that we can fast track that and get to a point where we can go to this community-based approach and not have Rikers Island, which is so symbolic of everything that's wrong with our criminal justice system.
And you mentioned that Judge Lippman participated in some of the conversations. For people outside New York, they don't realize he's not just an ordinary judge. He's the former chief judge of New York State, of the Court of Appeals, New York State's highest court. And I'm wondering if I think we have a selection of the quote from the report that we might be able to get on, that in the closing of Rikers Island, Judge Lippman wrote, quote, "Closing Rikers Island is far more than a symbolic gesture. It is an essential step toward a more effective and more humane criminal justice system. We must replace our current model of mass incarceration with something that is more effective and more humane, state-of-the-art facilities located closer to where the courts are operated in civic centers in each borough." Because one of the complaints you heard from many communities is that Rikers Island, because it was an island, isolated, with only one road coming in, it was very difficult for family members, even in the city, to visit their relatives who were incarcerated.
Exactly. I've gone to Rikers. It can take you a full day, because it's not only once you get there, getting there is difficult, but once you get there, having to wait to be able to see the person. I mean, it's just so, it ends up, that people sometimes do not get visited because it's so difficult and onerous. And plus, people can't take time off work. It would literally take your whole day. So this is what is wrong, right? And we've done video visitation programs. We've funded video visitation programs. We've done things as a city council and invested in policies and initiatives to try to bring more humanity into an inhumane system, right? But at the end of the day, we will be closing Rikers Island down. The issue now is the political will to try to fast track this, try to get this to happen before 10 years, to really look at how who gets arrested, who is held, the issue of bail. You mentioned the bail fund. People that are too poor to pay bail, the access to a fund so that they can leave and be able to wait for their court date. We have to dwindle the population down to a point where we can go to a community-based approach. But the community facilities is also, like, we already have the support of the council members where these facilities would be, because some of the facilities already exist, but they just have to be renovated and talk about a new state-of-the-art jail system. So there is support that we've been able to garner in order to get to a point where we could maybe move this on a quicker fast.
So let's go to some of the other legislation. The City Council voting for a slew of bills in these waning days of your city speakership, almost 40 pieces of legislation. This is our guest, Speaker Melissa Mark-Viverito, speaking about one of those bills last week.
And finally, the Council will vote on what is commonly known as the Right to Know Act. Introduction 182D, sponsored by Councilmember Richie Torres, would require that all sworn police officers employed by the NYPD offer a business card to an individual during certain police interactions and give reason for the law enforcement activity.
So that was Melissa Mark Viverito speaking ahead of the vote on the Right to Know Act last week. I also want to play a comment from Councilmember Jumaane Williams, who noted concerns raised by criminal justice reform advocates about its limitations.
If a police officer asks me for my ID and asks where I am going, that is not an investigatory, that is not a criminal stop on my ID. They will not give me a card under this bill. That is a majority of stops that are included.
So the Right to Know Act also drawing opposition from the police largest union. Talk about what exactly it said.
Well, I mean, look, you know, this has been an issue that we've been discussing for many years, and it was 2 bills. And so basically it is, as indicated in the clip, that it is about giving identification, giving a card to people that have an interaction with police officers. So, you know, we believe this is a major step forward. Councilmember Richie Torres, who is the sponsor of the bill, has held the bill for 4 years. Extensive negotiations that included the advocates, it included the police department, it included the administration, it included us, obviously, and a lot of back and forth on it. He arrived at a point where he felt comfortable with. He felt that it was a step forward. He felt that it was a way of really moving the police department in a direction that they originally had not wanted to go in. And so it is a big step forward. And I really give praise to Richie for how he worked on this bill. Now, the advocates, some of the advocates are not pleased with it, and you know, that's their right to be unhappy if they choose to be. But I believe, as the leader, that we worked with Richie and that he was able to move something forward and advance a reform that we've been discussing for many, many years. This ID, right? That interactions with police, they will have to give an ID card that has their name, it has their number, it has the precinct that they're affiliated with. It's something, again, that is not being done.
Well, I wanted to ask you about another issue. In March, Attorney General Jeff Sessions announced that cities applying for grants will have to certify that they are not providing sanctuary to undocumented immigrants.
Today, I'm urging states and local jurisdictions to comply with these federal laws, including 8 U.S.C. Section 1373. Moreover, the Department of Justice will require that jurisdictions seeking or applying for Department of Justice grants to certify compliance with 1373 as a condition of receiving those awards.
That was Attorney General Jeff Sessions. Obviously, this issue of sanctuary cities is one where I've said repeatedly that it seems that the local governments like New York City and the others around the country are on a collision course with the federal government over how you deal with undocumented immigrants. And I'm wondering your response to how you see what you've crafted in the city council and with the mayor in terms of responding to the Trump administration on this issue.
You know, it's very disturbing. I mean, you were talking to the judge earlier, who I respect greatly, but, you know, when we talk about whole cloth, how certain communities, you know, are being described by this administration, the immigrants are all takers or immigrants are all criminals. We're reporting that we have the lowest crime rates historically in the city of New York. That says something in terms of the way that we, right, interact with our communities. We need everyone to participate to make our city safe. And we know that the vast majority of immigrants are contributing positively to our economy and to our society here in the city of New York. We've been a welcoming city. Every policy we have in place, every law that we have in place, those are things that we have the ability to do as a city. We're not breaking any laws, right? Just because you choose AG Sessions and Trump to whole cloth say that immigrants don't belong here and you are racist and you want to implement those policies, doesn't mean that we as a city are going to enforce those policies. We have a different approach, and we believe that we are a welcoming city, and we support those who want to help us build this city. So we have the lowest crime rates, and we are proving, them wrong in terms of the facts. And so if they choose to take a course which is punitive, then they choose it, choose to go that route. They may not be allowed to do what they're threatening to do. Again, everything that we have in place is making us a safe city. People can step out of the shadows and help us, inform us of crimes or anything that they have any knowledge of. And so I'm very proud of the work that this council has done. I'm very proud of my stance in defending the city of New York to do what it needs to do.
You even created a bail fund for undocumented immigrants that are facing deportation.
Yes.
You talk about that?
Yes,
I know the Daily News has criticized it as saying, well, you would even provide bail support for terrorists. But the reality is, if someone's accused of terrorism at the national level, they don't have money. The government has to supply, pay for an attorney anyway.
No, right. So this is basically people have the ability to just have representation. And we've had an evaluation of that program and demonstrated that there are people that can, have the right to ask for to be represented, and that the results are in some cases people are even have status and don't even know it, right? So then when they go to court, they're able to really find out whether or not they have status. They're able to just make a case, and it's up to the courts to decide whether or not it's granted. But at least people have representation and have the ability to have and make a case, right? So this bail fund actually has now been modeled, and other cities have looked to really replicate it. And I'm very proud that it was a pilot program the year before it became Speaker, and I fully funded it in the first year I was Speaker to really allow everybody an opportunity to have representation.
You were also arrested under, this year, weren't you, protesting around DACA with a number of other Congress members outside Trump's residence?
Yes, Grijalva, Congressman Gutierrez, myself, Espaillat. Yes, we definitely, did that. We are against all the policies that are being presented. DACA, I know, continues to be a conversation. We have these young people that are losing their status in terms of the protection that DACA provides, and their teachers and their, service workers in some ways. This is really atrocious what's happening to our city, to our country, and so we are going to protest it. I will continue to protest it, as I leave office. It's an issue that I feel very passionate about, and I will continue to advocate.
So let's talk about Puerto Rico, where you were born. More than 3 months after Hurricane Maria battered Puerto Rico, about a third of the island remains without power in what's by far the longest blackout in modern U.S. history. Officials saying that won't be restored power, in some cases, till the end of May. Many Puerto Ricans celebrating Christmas in the dark.
We still don't have power, even 3 months after the hurricane. We're living without light. We're living off a generator, and when we don't have money for gasoline, we're making do with batteries, with little battery-powered decorations for the tree. Because us Puerto Ricans are very family-oriented, and we like to celebrate everything.
You've also went home since the storm. Yep. What do you think needs to be done? Have you considered running for governor of Puerto Rico or New York?
So my mother just got power yesterday. So it's almost 4 months.
Doesn't have power.
Right.
Real.
So what's happening to Puerto Rico is just terrible, and this tax bill is going to make it worse. A economy that was already fragile because of the emergency and the fiscal crisis now is going to be made worse when you have a 12.5% tax on products that are coming in, products that are manufactured on the island that are being brought mainland are going to be taxed. Potentially, we could lose 200,000 jobs. The issue of Puerto Rico is definitely not a priority on anyone's agenda. It's not on anyone's agenda, and this Congress is demonstrating it's turning its back. So there is serious work to be done. I want to help. I want to be a voice. I want to continue to give of my time and leadership on this issue. I think I can best do that on the mainland here, so I don't see myself running for office on the island. But I would definitely, with all the effort, there's a lot of support coming from philanthropy and other entities. I want to figure out a way that I can best serve and be able to help build an agenda to help Puerto Rico get back on track. It has to be an agenda that is defined by the people of Puerto Rico. We have to have the voices and people on the ground being able to help define what that future looks like. And so I want to figure out what that is. I don't know right now. It is such an overwhelming task, and there's so much work to do. We have to advocate in the Congress. We have great leadership in some of our representatives, but obviously the Republicans are not listening. But there's a lot of work to do, and I have to figure out the best way to do that.
Have you considered running for governor of New York?
No, I have not.
Mayor?
I have, I have 4 years to figure out what I'm going to do. There are going to be positions available. I'm not going to close the door on maybe exploring.
Congress, Senate?
If I will explore options as they come. I'm not closing any doors. I think I've done a great job. I have a great track record, and I think that I would definitely like to continue to serve this city in whatever capacity I can best do that.
Melissa Mark-Viverito, Speaker of the New York City Council. That does it for our broadcast. Democracy Now! Accepting applications for our paid year-long news production fellowship. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.